The teachings of General Conference are the considerations the Lord would have before us now and in the months ahead.
Our marching orders for each 6 months are found in the General Conference addresses.
For the next 6 months, your conference edition of the Ensign should stand next to your standard works and be referred to frequently.
I encourage you to read the talks once again and to ponder the messages contained therein.
I exhort you to study the messages of this conference frequently, even repeatedly, during the next 6 months.
You're listening to the Conference Talk podcast, where it's conference weekend every weekend. Each weekend we discuss talks from the most recent General Conference of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.
That's right. We'll share some insights, make some connections, and have a bit of fun as we study the words of the awesome men and women that God has called to direct His church in the latter days. I'm Brett Cain.
And I'm Richard Bernard. This episode, we're talking about Elder Christofferson's address, The Testimony of Jesus. Well, I don't know how many times I've looked at this conference talk, because we've also had it for Elders Quorum, and I'm in the habit of reviewing the conference talks. In fact, today I was making the dough for chocolate chip cookies, and I listened to some conference talks. So I've heard this several times, and I've got all sorts of things I've underlined here, and this is a great talk. It really is a great talk. What did you get from it, Brett?
You know, I'm so glad to hear that. You know, talking about listening to conference while you're making some chocolate chip cookies. That's it. That's the best way to multitask. I tell you what, this talk really means a lot to me. Elder Christofferson, if we're allowed to, have them as my favorite apostle. He came and spoke to me when I was in the Lima, Peru Missionary Training Center, and then he came to my stake in Washington shortly after I was married, and I got to meet him in person again, and it was really, really cool. So I've always loved his talks. I back when compact discs, CDs were a thing, I would burn CDs of just all of his conference talks. And now, of course, we have the wonderful Gospel Library app, and MP3s and YouTube and all sorts of streaming things to listen to these talks. So this was really cool. What stood out to me is I love how he begins in the third paragraph. He says, "Those in the celestial kingdom are they who received the testimony of Jesus, who are just men made perfect through Jesus, the mediator of the new covenant." And then he goes on to explain, the different degrees of glory. And I love the emphasis that he puts on this of receiving the testimony of Jesus. And he ends in the next paragraph, "Note that the distinguishing characteristic for the inhabitants of each kingdom is how they relate to the testimony of Jesus, ranging from one wholehearted devotion to not being valiant to outright rejection." And I think that our testimony is the best barometer for how we're doing spiritually and how we're progressing. So that's just one thing that stood out to me. How about you?
Well, first of all, I got to say, you don't look old enough to have to be burning CDs. I mean, that was like 30 years ago, wasn't it?
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah. Well, I was a bit of a late bloomer. So I'm 34 years old, and I held on to CDs as long as I could. I came home from my mission, and everyone had smartphones, and I didn't get a smartphone for several years after that until I got married, and all my vehicles didn't have Bluetooth. So I was like, I'm going to keep using CDs as long as I can. And finally, I had to give up that fight. And it's incredible that you're obviously much more experienced and venerable than me, and you were the one that got me to make the jump to the Gospel Library app, and I haven't been able to shut up about it since you converted me. And now I taught Elders Quorum last week, and I was telling them all about what I had learned from you and the related content and how we can save those notes. So you've done a great job.
Well, thank you. I'm glad we have another convert to the Gospel Library. I was reflecting back. My first PC I bought had a 40 megabyte hard drive, and they said that's all we would ever need.
Wow. And look how far we've come.
Yeah, it just shows you how far we've actually come. Well, getting back to this, I never really thought about this connection of the testimony of Jesus is what separates those three kingdoms. It just never appealed to me, or not that it didn't appeal to me, but didn't appear to me, and I really got thinking about that, and I found it very interesting as I went on down. Now, he got this broken down into sections. What is the testimony of Jesus, which I think is a great introduction here. And it is the witness that the Holy Spirit, that he is the divine Son of God, the Messiah and the Redeemer. And it's John's testimony that Jesus was in the beginning with God, that he's the creator of heaven and earth. And in him was the gospel, and the gospel was the life, and the life was the light of men. And he goes on, it's the testimony of the apostles and prophets that he died, was buried, and rose again the third day. It's the knowledge that there is no other name given whereby salvation cometh. It's the testimony, last of all, given by the prophet Joseph Smith, that he lives, and that he's the only begotten of the Father, that by him and through him and of him the worlds are and were created, and the inhabitants thereof are begotten sons and daughters of God. And so I think he's done an excellent job of just taking all of these things and just putting them into one package here.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I like that you said that. It does seem like a simple thing, and one of the things that stood out to me too is when he talks about being valiant in the testimony of Jesus and what exactly that means. I think to fast and testimony meeting, the first Sunday of every month is my favorite. There are a lot of stereotypes where people will laugh, whether or not what constitutes a testimony or not, but testifying, bearing witness of Jesus Christ that is the gospel. Like the fact that Jesus Christ lived and died and rose again, and everything he did before and in between and since and does now, that is the gospel. I love in 3rd Nephi when Jesus Christ says that this is his gospel, that the Father sent him to be lifted up by men so that he can lift us all up. And I like that what Elder Christofferson says here. Being valiant in the testimony of Jesus means encouraging others by word and example to likewise be valiant, especially of our own families. And he goes on to quote Elder Neil A. Maxwell, who once addressed the essentially honorable members of the church who are skimming over the surface instead of deepening their discipleship, and who are casually engaged rather than anxiously engaged. That really stood out to me.
Yes. Maxwell has great quotes.
Yes, he does.
In fact, I remember some general authorities said whenever he spoke, they had a dictionary in their hand because he would use words that we weren't familiar with. But he just had a way of taking common things and just bringing it home to us. I was reflecting there where you were talking about testimony meeting. It was sometime this year that I learned that there's a difference between saying I bear my testimony and I testify.
Oh, I didn't know that. What's the difference?
Well, the difference is that you are, how can I put it here? You are testifying. It's like you're testifying in a court. And it's your absolute belief, where when you say, I bear my testimony, it's just not the same thing. And then, so I did some research of the general authorities from General Conference, and about 95% of the time they say, I testify. They don't say, I bear my testimony.
Wow, that's amazing.
So
that's really cool.
So it's something to think about. In fact, I got to look at the bottom of this talk here. What is he? Here he doesn't testify. He just says, in the name of Jesus Christ, amen. But there is a difference, and I can't remember exactly why that difference is. I'd have to go back and look it up again. But I'm always careful now in testimony meeting, if I bear my testimony, to say I testify. And when I give devotionals, I've changed it to I testify.
That's really cool.
Because of the
yeah,
meaning.
I jumped ahead to the next two talks, and then I looked at the end, and both of them said I testify.
Yeah.
So
yeah,
the two talks after that. So yeah, there's something to that. That's remarkable. And see, and that's what I'm talking about. And that's what Elder Maxwell, I think, is talking about. It's just, we're not skimming on the surface, because how many honorable members of the church have gone their whole lives without appreciating, that little detail. And there's so much, we can always get better. Not to say that anyone who's ever said I bear my testimony is wrong, but it's like, no, like let's do it. Let's do better. Let's learn more.
Yes.
So I think that's really cool.
Yeah. So in the third section, he says, what does it mean to be valiant in the testimony of Jesus? And he says it includes nurturing and strengthening that testimony. And then down a little bit further, he says, President Nelson reminds us that with frightening speed, a testimony that is not nourished daily by the good word of God can crumble. Thus, we need daily experience worshiping the Lord and studying his gospel. Again and again, the brethren several times during this conference have emphasized the importance of studying the scriptures daily. And yes, that's my mission, and yes, I'm always going to mention studying the scriptures daily. But here is just a prophet of God saying we need to study the gospel daily and worshiping the Lord daily. And as I read this, I'm going, okay, I'm studying the scriptures daily, but am I worshiping the Lord daily? And what does that actually mean? Because I learned something over the last few weeks. I shared the quote with my wife. In fact, I will go to that now. This quote comes from Elder Maxwell, but he is quoting Elder Ashton and makes the following statement. Elder Marvin J. Ashton of the Council of the 12 warned of another consequence of not heeding. Any church member not obedient to the leaders of this church will not have the opportunity to be obedient to the promptings of the Lord. That's a powerful statement. If we have President Nelson saying we need to worship daily and study the scriptures daily, and if we can't heed that, we're not going to heed any promptings from the Lord. And so Elder Maxwell went on to say, a lack of obedience to the leaders will therefore mean that we will not have the precious promptings of the Spirit, which we need personally. Now, this goes back to August of 1973. This is from the Munich area conference report. So we're talking a lot of years have gone by before President Nelson came into the picture. In fact, it was about the time I think he came into the picture, and where he's talking about thinking celestially. But if we don't heed these small things that are coming from our prophet, then we're not going to get those precious promptings of the Spirit. And I guess if I had to phrase it my own way, if the Spirit says, well, you're not listening to a living prophet, why would you even listen to me? And so that's something that we miss.
Yeah, that's really true. And yeah, I love the quote that he continues quoting President Nelson when he says, give him, God, a fair share of your time.
Oh,
And I think
yes.
it's really like just that idea. We're so busy. I think humankind is busier now than they've ever been. Um, whether or not that equates to uh, a commensurate rate of work being performed, I don't think so. But I mean, there's so many demands on our time. I mean, we can be plugged into social media, our phones, our jobs, constantly, to say nothing of spending meaningful time with friends and family. But on top of that, we absolutely need to give God a fair share of your time. And like we said at the beginning, I mean, you had something to do, you were making cookies. Hey, I'm going to include God in this and listen to some conference talks. And I think that's right. I mean, you could have listened to music or, to listen to a podcast or listen to it. Say, hey, I'm going to fill this with the best thing I can do.
I had the same question that really struck out to me too, a fair share. And the audience doesn't know by now, I'm dyslexic and I struggle with the meaning of words. And so what I have to do is look these things up. And so I said, what does it mean, a fair share of my time? And so the answer I got was, to do a fair share of one's time typically means to spend a reasonable or expected amount of time engaged in a particular activity or experience. A reasonable and expected amount of time. And I think you and I, we could stop. I could see having this discussion in an elders quorum, what that means, reasonable and expected amount of time, because it still leaves some vagueness in there. It often implies doing or experiencing something to a sufficient or expected degree without excess or deficiency. So, boy, it really got me thinking, am I giving it a fair share of my time? Now, I think about tithing, and tithing is 10%, and one can give more than 10% if they want. But 10% of our money, what about 10% of our time? And we've got 24 hours. That's 2 hours and a half.
Yeah.
I think most of our listeners are going 2.5 hours for the Lord and worshiping and studying scriptures. I've got 4 children I have to take care of, and they're all going to soccer games and everything. So I think this is something someone has to work out and decide, and that's where the Spirit dictates and helps us, teach us what is a fair share of our time. It's like the same thing is we're asked to attend the temple as often as our circumstances allow. Well, what does that mean? And I've often wondered, in fact, I was discussing with my wife, how many members of the church, after that has been said, sat down with their spouse and said, okay, what is a considerable amount of time for the temple based upon our circumstances? Or how many of us just kind of gloss over it and don't want to get into it because we might have to make some commitments we don't want to make? And so these are all these little things that, going back to Elder Ashton, if we don't pay attention to them from our general authorities, then we're not going to give those promptings from the Spirit.
Very true. And you know what I was thinking about this is, yeah, and I think that it's not specific for a reason, because so the Feather River Temple here in town, just down the road, right now it's open up to volunteers to come in and help clean the temple. And we love to do that, moving furniture, vacuuming. And even those who don't have temple recommends or have small children can just show up first thing in the morning and help clean the grounds, pull weeds, rake the flower beds. And it's such a good opportunity. I mean, there's no excuse. I mean, there's so many chances to give God some time. And we don't have to wait until God's awake or wait for his office hours or schedule an appointment. Obviously, for the temple, it's good if you can schedule an appointment, but to just read our scriptures, it's not like we have to go to some library and check them out. We've got them on our phones. And I think about working out, and there are people who can go to the gym and spend 2.5 hours in the gym and get a great workout. And there are people who can go for 45 minutes and get just as good of a workout. There are people who can run for 15 minutes and hey, that's as much workout as I can do today, but you did something. And so I think that's the point. I don't think it's necessarily quantity, although, the more the better. It's all about quality. I mean, in the last few years, we've gone from a 3-hour church block down to a 2. And I'm sure that there are people who attended 3-hour church blocks who did not get as much spiritual momentum developed as people who go for 2 hours now, or even people who work and can only make it to sacrament. So I don't think that necessarily focusing on the amount, but getting into a consistent habit of, hey, this is my default. Like first thing, it's like, hey, of course I'm going to listen to the conference while I'm doing this other thing. And if our default is to give time to the Lord, that's going to be a really good indicator. So if have to decide between conference talk or music or some, and like put a conference talk in first. And that's what I tried to do growing up, is if I wanted to get good at the guitar, I knew I had to include the Lord. So I would learn to play a hymn on the guitar first. And if I wanted to draw, I had to draw a picture of a Book of Mormon scene first. And if I wanted to read or write, I had to read my scriptures first. And that was an exercise that I did that really helped me in all aspects. And it made me realize, like, I can't do anything without the Lord. So I have to include him in any venture I pursue.
That is a great comment. First of all, back to how much time we spend. It doesn't matter. What matters is that we've gone to the Lord and said, what do I need to do in my circumstances now? And for everybody, it's going to be different. I'm retired. I can go to the temple every day if I want. And there are people your age. I think that might be a little bit difficult because you've got to work 8 hours or 10 hours a day, and then you got children, and that becomes very, very difficult, and family is very important. So yeah, it's not the time, but it's turning our heart to the Lord and going, the prophet has said we need to spend time at the temple based upon our circumstances. What should I do? And I love what you said about learning guitar. By the way, do you play guitar really well now?
Not very. I didn't keep up with it. I played throughout my mission and got pretty good afterward. But I'm not musically inclined. My mother and my sisters and my wife and my daughter are all super gifted, but I can't carry a tune in a bucket. I still remember everything that I learned previously, but I haven't progressed beyond that.
Okay. Well, I think it's great examples of how you were giving your fair share of your time, but you incorporated it with drawing or learning music. And I think that's a great example of how we can incorporate him in our lives. And yes, making chocolate chip cookies is another way to do it. And actually, I have 2 geek podcasts that I listen to every week. And I almost hit the button to listen to that podcast, and then I just felt a prompting. I said, listen to the conference talks. And so I pushed the other button and started listening to the conference talks. And one of them was this talk here, because I think wasn't he the first, or I can't remember what part of the session he was in, but
yeah, I think he was the first speaker.
Well, yeah, I love what he said, and we got President Nelson, and he gives some excellent examples here, how we need to heed his messengers, which gets us back to the quote by Elder Maxwell. And being valiant means being open and public about our witness. And being valiant in the testimony of Jesus means encouraging others. And being anxiously engaged in his work. And then I love this story, and I've heard it before, by Elder Grogberg.
Yes, that was just the spot that I was looking at right now. I'm so glad you brought that up. I hadn't heard this story before, but Elder Groberg came to speak at the Missionary Training Center in Provo when I was there for just 2 weeks. And his brother, who's also named John Groberg, was the Peru MTC president at the time. So I got to go from one Elder Groberg to another, and so that was pretty cool. Yes, but please, if you want to tell the story, I loved it.
Yeah, it's a great story. I'll just sum it up. This took place in Hawaii, and it was in the early 1900s. And a family went. The father and the son blessed the sacrament, or tried to bless the sacrament, and the the branch president stood up and said, "Stop and get out of here, because your daughter is very sick and we don't know what's wrong with her, and maybe she's got a disease and you're going to carry it," and on and on. So they got up and they left. And the father, a great man, because he didn't react right away. He went home. They sat in a circle as a family, and he said, "Don't stay here and don't talk until I'm ready to talk." And he just had to work through his mind, and they said his fists were clenched. And the family was wondering, maybe Dad's coming up with the way that we can get revenge on the on the branch president. And I think they talked about stealing or killing his pigs or something like that. And then they saw the father begin to relax. He's no longer clenching his fist. And he says that, "I love all of you, and I want to be with you forever, and the only way to do that is through the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And we're going to go back to church. We'll keep our distance from people, but this is not the branch president's church." And basically he just humbly said, "Okay, we were kicked out, but we're going to keep going back." That is a testimony, because I think a lot of people, I've known people over my time in the church that the bishop said something wrong during sacrament meeting and they just don't show up for church anymore.
Yeah.
Or somebody got offended. Of course, it's Elder Bednar that said, but by the way, I'm sorry, you've got your favorite apostle. I thought everyone's favorite apostle was Elder Bednar. But anyway.
He is great too.
Elder Bednar is the one I always look to. But Elder Bednar says you don't have to go very far into the lobby of the church to be offended. And so I've just seen so many people turn away because a ward has split and your best friends are in the other ward and you're in this other ward and don't know anybody. And so, well, I'm not going to go to church anymore. And there was one man years ago that just would not go to church as long as that man was bishop. And once he was released, he started coming back to church. And so this story that Groberg talks about, I think, is great, because I'm looking here, it says the young son wondered what they would do to get revenge. And it was to kill the president's pigs or burn his house.
Burn down his house or join another church.
Join another church.
Yeah.
And so then they talk about how this father and grandfather became a legend within the family and such a righteous leader that he was able to realize what's really important.
Yes. It reminded me, so I had two stories from my mission. The first one, as far as I know, didn't have a happy ending. And we had a family that was set to be baptized. And on the day of the baptism, we could not find anyone who had keys to the chapel. Whoever had keys to the chapel had left the town and had brought them with them. And we didn't have a cell phone. We didn't have any means of communication. And so we were scrambling, and this family showed up to the church early, and they found the doors locked. No one was there, and they were so offended that they never came back, and we could never teach them again. So that was really sad, and I hope that they're okay. The second was a family that was baptized, and the family was invited to give the invocation in church. And as he approached the stand, he was asked by a member of the bishopric not to give the prayer because he didn't have a white shirt and tie. He had
Oh my
a nice collared shirt,
God.
and he was very offended by that. And as they didn't come back, I hope things are good with that. I haven't stayed in touch, but that was really sad to see. And there are
Yes.
things like that all the time. And I never thought that it would even be a temptation, but even in my own ward, there are, factions and divisions and strifes and backbitings, and it's like, wow, like these are actual things that will make our foundations crumble if we let them.
Yes. And that's what he's talking about in this address, is that, quoting from Maxwell, of kind of being on the surface rather than being rooted deeply. It's important that I've been offended so many times at church, I just let it roll off me. I don't go to church because of other people. I go to church because it's the Lord's church, and I want to participate in the sacrament and listen to the talks. And I'm not going to turn away. But it's so easy to see these type of things happen. And there's nothing in the gospel or the Book of Mormon or the Bible that says you got to have a white shirt.
Right. Exactly.
And I remember when I was bishop, there was a box about this big. People can't see it, but quite a big box that had ties in it. I mean, really old ties, and they were stained. And I mean, they were like 8-inch ties, and things. And first thing I did, I said, we're throwing these ties out. And they said, but wait, sometimes our young men forget to have ties. And I said, where in the scriptures does it say you have to have a tie?
Yeah.
What it does say is that you have to be worthy. And so if someone's worthy, I'm not going to worry if they got a tie. I'm more concerned that they got a tie on and they're not worthy.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so I don't know how these things get started, that we got to have ties and things. But and I understand in our society that, of course, that's changing. I'm seeing how people are coming to the temple in different clothing. But over the last 100 years here in the United States, a tie and a shirt and a suit meant more being formally dressed. And I have one friend that he says, I occasionally try to stir things up. I come with a blue shirt and tie.
That's funny. Yeah, I remember it was a couple years ago. I was in Washington State, and we had a general authority visiting, and I'd come right from work, and I was just in a long sleeve shirt, my work boots, jeans, and uh, I love to sit up front, and I sat right up front. I was the only person not in church dress, and it was during state conference. It was a Saturday, and I felt like such a schmuck, but he didn't make me feel bad at all. He had me participate, and it was really nice, and I felt bad, but I think that we do have to get past, what are other people going to think? And obviously, do your best, try your best. But the Lord looketh on the heart. That's something
Yes.
that we're
Yeah.
reminded of again and again in the scriptures. And yeah, that's funny. Your friend likes to shake things up, but talk about like having a testimony. I mean, we're getting to the point of the Book of Mormon of Alma and the Zoramites, and it was those people who had been cast out of the synagogue who were humble enough to receive that, and it could be a chapel of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints where someone feels cast out of.
Yeah.
But if we want to be valiant, if we want to be true to the Lord, it's developing that testimony and being valiant in it. And I think that's the cool thing about this talk. And I'm so glad that this is kind of the direction that we've taken it. I wanted to just read this one part of it, uh, where Elder Christofferson says, "My invitation is to act now to secure your place as one who is valiant in the testimony of Jesus. As repentance may be needed, do not procrastinate the day of your repentance, lest in an hour when ye think not, the summer shall be past, and the harvest ended, and your souls not saved. Be zealous in keeping your covenants with God. Do not be offended by the strictness of the word. Remember to retain the name of Christ written always in your hearts, that ye may hear and know the voice by which ye shall be called, and also the name by which he shall call you. And finally, settle this in your hearts, that ye will do the things which Jesus shall teach and command you." I think that's just an amazing invitation. And, and it's hard. Like, I'm not trying to be dismissive at all. But it is funny how these traditions start. So you and I were speaking before we started this episode, and I have officiated and dedicated a burial plot today. And this sweet sister was expressing concern that her mother, who's not a member of the church, had indicated that she wanted to be buried facing west. And the sister's like, "I know we're supposed to be buried facing east." And I said, "There's not, like, that's not doctrine. Like, it's not a requirement that you have to be buried facing east." And she was relieved to hear. But there are these kind of little folk tales that I think, and
Yes.
and there's something to be said for some traditions, but like the Book of Mormon says, like, that there are also false traditions
Yes.
and traditions that are not correct, and we have to avoid those.
Yes, absolutely. Now, just a few paragraphs before what you just read, I have an underline here. One last aspect of being valiant in the testimony of Jesus that I will mention is our individual pursuit of personal holiness. I think that's so important. When I go to church like Elders Quorum or Sunday school, I'm hoping that I'm a better person when I leave. That the Spirit spoke to me and taught me, not necessarily what the lesson's about or what the reliefs or the Elders Quorum teacher's teaching about, but I've learned something that helps me just 1 millimeter movement toward becoming more Christ-like. And then hopefully I can do something with that. And this is what I think this talk is really all about, is becoming better people each week. And that we can look back a year back and go, I'm not the same person I was a year ago. I'm a little bit more patient with people. Or I look at people differently. I see people as children of God, despite the fact of how they're dressed or the tattoos or things on their faces or earrings or whatever, or dyed hair, that they are a child of God. And that's what it's all about. There's no way we can become perfect. In Matthew 5:40, it says, "Therefore be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect," but doesn't mean the perfect that we think it means. And that we just need to be on that path, and as Elder Christofferson says, is to be true to that testimony of Jesus. Just doing our best. And I think there's too many members of the church that just feel they're not doing enough. And I don't know if we have to do enough. And you mentioned it before. I think it's the quality and why we're doing it. If one can really only go to the temple once a month, and that's their conversation with the Lord, and they keep that promise, that is just as valid as somebody who goes to the temple every day. Now, at our temple, we have this couple, the Gillespies. They're not in our ward. I had to ask what their name was. But he's very bent over with a walker. He can only see the floor. And he just has to shuffle along, and his wife is just so sweet and takes care of him. And they were in the ceiling room with me, and I said, "You're here every day, aren't you?" And they said, "Yes, we are." And And I said, where do you live? And they said, well, about three minutes down the road. But what it takes to get him in a car, to get him into the temple, and it's amazing, but that's what they can do. And someone who can only get there once a month shouldn't feel like they're not doing enough. If that conversation with the Lord, the Spirit's confirmed that you're doing what you can at this time. And being old enough to know what it is to raise children and have grandchildren and great-grandchildren, there was times in my life where I was working 60 hours a week. And you're doing what you can. You're trying to pay the bills and keep a roof over the kids' head and food on the table and shoes on their feet. And some people might feel, well, I only had 10 minutes with the scriptures today. That's wonderful. And so this is what I like about Christofferson's talk, is that it's having that testimony of Jesus. And if we just have that, and we listen to the Spirit, we follow the prophet, we study daily, if that's 5 minutes or 2 hours, that we'll receive revelation upon revelation that will tell us that what we're doing, we're on the correct path.
That's beautiful. I love that. And I was thinking, like, so, I wrote some books, and I knew I wanted to make it themed towards the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And part of that is because I want to, in everything I do, I want to honor God. But also because I know I'm not a very good writer. I'm not a very good drawer. I'm not a very good musician. And recognizing that, like, I can do nothing of myself. Alma 26:12. I know that I am weak I know that I am nothing as to my strength. I am weak. Therefore, I will not boast of myself, but I will boast of my God. And having that attitude, recognize, like, hey, if I want to succeed at anything, I have to include the Lord. And I think that might be harder for people who are naturally gifted in a lot of ways. Like my wife, she's an amazing cook, and every day she astounds me with her cooking prowess. Today we had the sister missionaries over for dinner, and it was especially good. I was like, hey, the Lord's consecrating our efforts. If we're doing something like this, chocolate chip cookies, I bet they'll be extra tasty if you plan on sharing those with someone you minister to, or anything like that. And I think that if everyone can figure out a way to invite the Lord in to their lives, and even in this most seemingly mundane aspects of it, they will find that their paths are blessed.
Yes, absolutely. And as far as the chocolate chip cookies, I never make them for myself. They're always to give out. And tomorrow in the evening, there's an activity going on, and that's my participation. If they sit in the house, they talk to me. I can be upstairs, and I hear a chocolate chip cookie going, I'm here, come on. So I have to make sure I don't leave them in the house. Well, I appreciate your comments. They've been great, and this is a great talk, and I hope those who are listening will go back and listen to it or read it, because there's some really great material in there, as with all the conference talks. And it's why we've been asked to review them again and again and again during those 6 months. Absolutely.
Thank you all for listening to the Conference Talk podcast. This episode, we discussed the testimony of Christ, of Jesus, by Elder D. Todd Christofferson.
If you enjoyed this episode, give us a 5-star rating anywhere you get podcasts.
And check out our website, conferencetalk.org, where you can follow us on social media, drop a comment, check out the show notes, and learn more about us, your hosts.
If you want to follow me, you can do so at richard@thebusylatterdaysaint.com. You can also find me at my podcast by the same name, The Busy Latter-day Saint, or my website at thebusylatterdaysaint.com.
And you can find me at Brett W. Cain on X, and my podcast, Ironside Podcast.
But while we always appreciate new followers, it's better to follow the prophet and the apostles themselves.
Affirmative. We love speaking about the church and our leaders, but we do not speak for them. Everything said on this podcast represents our own personal opinions.
So join us next time in making every weekend Conference Weekend on the Conference Talk Podcast.